Okay, so as you all know, even though we had a week off last week, we have been in First Samuel. And when we last left David 2 weeks ago, he was on the run from Saul. So remember, Saul had decided to kill David to eliminate him as a rival. And David had run. And you might remember that David, when we last saw him, had sojourned for a short time in the land of the Philistines. Now, when David got there, he thought he might be able to present himself as a soldier of fortune and to fight for the Philistines. But the Philistines knew who he was. They recognized him. They knew the songs that Israel sung about him, that he had killed tens of thousands of Philistines. And so David feared his life was in danger. He acted as a madman. He let spittle run down his beard. He scratched the gates of the city and clawed them like an animal. And so the king of Gath said, "Who is this guy? Why do I need him here? The guys I have around me are already crazy enough. I don't need another crazy guy." And so he sent David away. And First Samuel 22, which we're going to look at tonight, tells us what happens next. So in First Samuel 22, we see what happens in the rest of the story. And so First Samuel 22 does continue to document David's life as a fugitive on the run. And this existence is going to continue for many chapters. David is going to be running for a while now. Again, it's sort of going to be like, that old TV show, The Fugitive, where each week there's a different way that David is running and a different danger that he faces. But we are going to see David going from place to place, trying to avoid Saul. But First Samuel 22, 1 through 2 describe what happened in the immediate aftermath of leaving Gath. And so First Samuel 22, verse 1 says, David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. So after leaving Gath, David runs to a cave. And if you think about it, that makes sense. As we see David run around and avoid Saul, we are going to see that he frequently hides in caves while he is on the lam. And I think you can see the strategic reasons for that. First, caves are often in mountainous regions. And so if you're in a mountainous region, you have the high ground. You can spot your enemy coming. Your enemy has to fight uphill to be able to get at you. Those are all things that give you an advantage. Also, caves provided an opportunity to hide. Caves could often be quite large, they could be quite deep, they could have different tunnels and channels as a part of them. Sometimes a cave could open on one side of the mountain, and there could be an opening on the other side, so you could actually escape through a mountain in a cave. And so you can see the strategic advantage of that. There's a fighting advantage and there's a hiding advantage in being able to get into a cave. Now, the reason he probably chose this cave of Adullam is because Adullam was in the territory of Judah. And of course, Judah was the territory of David's own tribe. And so, if David could expect to get help anywhere, he could certainly expect to get help in Judah. Now, we're going to see that the people of Judah were not universally willing to help him, that there will be people in Judah who are willing to sell him out. But still, if he's going to get support anywhere, Judah is the place where he's most likely going to get it. And so David goes to this place, Adullam, and some people think that Adullam was in a type of badlands, a sort of wilderness area where a lot of outlaws hid. I don't know that there's really any historical evidence for that. I think people just surmise that because that's where David goes. But it's also possible that David's the first quote unquote outlaw, to decide to hide out there. So I don't know that we can say, this was a place with a bad reputation. So while David hides in Adullam, he builds an army. And we're told that David's brothers and his father's household join him in Adullam. Now, they probably come to David for two reasons. One, they come to David because they want to support him. Hopefully, they love their brother and they want to protect him and defend him. And so they come to join him to keep him safe from Saul. But we have seen before that David and his brothers didn't always get along, that there was times where David and his brothers had conflict. And so it's also possible that David's brothers come to him because they are refugees themselves. If Saul wanted to kill David, he probably also wanted to kill David's immediate family. Saul might have seen David's brothers, if they remained alive, as becoming rivals to the throne. He didn't know about Samuel's sorting process of the brothers. And so, probably if Saul is out to get David, in the ancient world, that meant he was out to get David's entire family. And so David's brothers come to him and his family members, not just to support David, but also because they are likely on the run themselves. And so they are trying to stay safe together. The idea that there is safety in numbers. But we're also told in these verses, in verse 2, that David didn't just attract his family. Verse 2 tells us that he also attracted people who were disaffected by Saul's rules, by Saul's rule. And so you see in verse 2, all those who are in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, David, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. And so you just have people who, Saul, again, he was not the most righteous guy. Saul certainly persecuted people who were innocent. He made enemies of people who wished him no harm. And then Saul's policies as king undoubtedly caused economic suffering, high taxes, and other things. Remember, Samuel had warned the people of Israel that when they got a king, the king was going to conscript sons and daughters into his service. He was going to hit them with high taxes. And so undoubtedly there were people who were suffering under Saul's policies. And so when they heard that David had run from Saul and they saw David as a potential leader against Saul, they began to rally around him. And so just, from a literary standpoint, like this just reminds me of Robin Hood and his merry men, right? Like this is what you think of. And we're told there are about 400 men, and likely there were women and children with them as well. So a sizable group, maybe up to 1,000 people that were trying to eke out an existence in what was likely a very, very barren place and a very, very difficult place to live. Now, David's mother and father were too old to stay with David in a rugged place where they might have to flee quickly. And so David makes arrangements for his parents to be elsewhere. Verses 3 through 5 describe that. It says, "From there, David went to Mizpah in Moab and said to the king of Moab, 'Would you let my father and mother come and stay with you until I learn what God will do for me?' So he left them with the king of Moab and then stayed with him as long as David was in the stronghold. But the prophet Gad said to David, 'Do not stay in the stronghold, go into the land of Judah.' So David left and went to the forest of Hereth." Now, David knows that his mom and dad can't take life in the cave of Adullam. It's going to be cold in the cave. It's going to be damp. Life in the world was already rugged, but life here was going to be even more rugged than what the people were used to. And so David knows he needs to find a place where his parents can be safe. David's other concern also is probably that if they have to run, his parents can't run that quickly. Being elderly, they weren't that mobile. And so David needed to find a place for them to be safe. And so David takes his parents to Moab and he asks if they can find refuge there. Now, this might seem surprising because, after all, Moab and Israel are enemies. You remember there are tensions between Moab and Israel that dated all the way back to the time of the Exodus, so several hundred years before David came along. And you might remember that Deuteronomy had even said that Moabites were banned from the tabernacle until the 10th generation. And so there was a lot of tension, ethnic and otherwise, between Moabites and Israelites. So why did David feel free to take his parents to Moab? Well, remember one thing. Remember that Ruth is David's great grandmother. You remember Ruth, of course, from the book of Ruth. We studied that earlier this year as we were working our way through the Old Testament. And you remember where Ruth was from. Ruth was from Moab. Israel had received her, and so no, now Moab is going to receive her relative. So, in a sense, it's like going back to the homeland for one of the grandparents that David's parents end up there. And so verse 4 makes it sound like David's parents were only in Moab a short time. I sort of find verse 4 a little bit confusing. I'm not sure that I understand it completely because verse 4 says, So he, David, left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him as long as David was in the stronghold. So that sounds clear enough. David dropped his parents in Moab, and then he left them. He went away from them and he went back to the stronghold, which presumably is the cave of Adullam. So as long as David was in the stronghold, they were there. But then we're told in verse 5 that the prophet Gad said to David, Do not stay in the stronghold, go into the land of Judah. So David left and went into the forest of Hereth. So then that means he left the stronghold. So at that point, did David's parents go back with him? Were they that quickly gone from Moab? Like, why even take them there in the first place? Especially if part of the goal was they wouldn't have to run with you. I think maybe stronghold is being used in a broader way here in verse 4, but then verse 5 seems to narrow the term. I can't quite follow exactly what is happening here. I mean, the most obvious meaning would be David dropped his parents off in Moab. He went back to the stronghold. Gad told him to leave the stronghold. He went and yanked his parents out of Moab, and then they started running with him. That would seem to be the most obvious literal meaning of the text, but it doesn't really seem to make sense. And so I think there's probably some nuance in the original language that I am missing since I don't really study Hebrew, or that others are missing. But what we do see here, at least, is that David was concerned for his parents. And so we see another example in the Bible of David showing concern for his parents. And of course, David's descendant Jesus would show concern for his mother from the cross. And David here is again paving the way for Christ to come and being a type of the forebearer type of Jesus who was to come. And so, however it happened, Gad alerted David to danger if he remained in the stronghold, said he had a message from the Lord as a prophet. And so David moved to the forest of Hereth. Now, Jewish scholars who study Hebrew and know the language quite well say that this place was not truly a forest, that it was more of a wilderness. So, in other words, it didn't have a lot of trees. It was more of a rocky, sandy, dry, barren place where very little survived. Whatever it was, that's where David ended up. The interesting thing is that Hereth has the same consonants as the Hebrew word for freedom. And so some people see a pun being made here. He went to the forest or the wilderness of freedom when in fact he was not free and was running for his life. So a little bit of a play on words, a little bit of irony found in the Hebrew description of the text. And so David is running furiously from place to place, fearing that Saul might be after him. And while all this is going on, Saul is indeed very much looking for his enemy. And so, in fact, 1 Samuel 22, 6 through 8 show us that Saul is paranoid. Not only is he looking for David, but he's starting to see enemies all around him. He's starting not to trust anyone who is in his inner circle. Look at 1 Samuel 22, 6 through 8. It says, Now Saul heard that David and his men had been discovered, and Saul was seated, spear in hand, under the tamarisk tree on the hill at Gibeah, with all his officials standing at his side. He said to them, Listen, men of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make all of you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? Is that why you have all conspired against me? No one tells me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is concerned about me or tells me that my son has incited my servant to lie in wait for me as he does today. And so in verses 6 through 8, Saul holds a meeting of his royal officials. We could say that this would be the equivalent of a cabinet meeting today. If you're trying to say, what would this be like in the 21st century? It'd be like the president gathering his cabinet around him. And we are told that this meeting is held under a tamarisk tree. So they're not in the Oval Office, so to speak. They're not in the palace. They're under a tamarisk tree. Now, you might say, why is that important? Why are we told that the meeting was under a tamarisk tree? Why do we need to do that? Well, you know how presidents will sometimes have news conferences or they'll give speeches, and they'll do it in certain backdrops. Like George Bush, I remember right after 9/11, I think it was, he gave a speech on like a naval destroyer or naval air carrier, speak of military strength. Or often you'll see presidents like give a speech in front of the Great Seal, of the United States to communicate the authority and power of the United States. Very likely, Saul is doing something very similar here because the tamarisk tree might well have become one of the symbols of Israel. Back in Genesis 21, all the way back to the book of Genesis, Abraham, of course, the father of Israel, planted a tamarisk tree when he called on the name of the Lord. And the interesting thing about Abraham's planting of this tamarisk tree is he did it after he made a treaty with the Philistines. Now, who are the enemies that Saul and David are fighting in Israel during this time period? It is the Philistines. And so Saul and David likely knew the stories of Abraham from the book of Genesis. And so the tamarisk tree may have become a symbol of Israelite strength in the face of Philistine oppression. And so Saul puts himself in front of this tamarisk tree to remind people who the enemy is and to remind people who has had success against the enemy Saul has. He has led several successful missions and fights against the Philistines. And so even though there are no cameras, like Saul is making the photo op moment here, he is reminding people of Israel's strength and his own strength as Israel's king. Now, we're also told that the meeting occurs while Saul holds a spear in his hand. And if you are a cabinet member and you are gathered around and Saul is speaking angry words, it is certainly ominous that Saul is holding a spear in his hand, right? Because we have already seen that Saul is not afraid to throw a spear at people who displease him. He's thrown a spear at David on several occasions. He's even thrown a spear at his own son, Jonathan, trying to kill him. And so when Saul has this meeting with his spear in his hand, fiddling with it as he talks, he is clearly threatening his officials and sending a message to them that he's not afraid to kill them if they don't start supporting him and doing what he wants. And so the purpose of Saul's meeting here is twofold. One, Saul decries the loyalty of his officials. And so Saul suggests to his officials that they are more loyal to Jonathan than to him. Right? Saul says to the officials, you guys should have known that Jonathan and David were getting chummy. I find it hard to believe that you didn't know Jonathan had greater affection for David than for me. And since you knew that, one of you should have reported this situation to me, but none of you did that. And so I'm beginning to think that some of you are siding against me. Now, Saul's probably pragmatic. He knows he can't get rid of all of these guys and be successful. So he's trying to challenge them to make sure they are loyal, but he's not afraid to do it without a threat. And so Saul wants to assure the loyalty of his officials. So he not only tries to threaten them, as it were, but he also tries to bribe them. That's sort of the second goal that Paul has here. He's going to threaten his officials and he's going to bribe them. He's going to use the stick and the carrot, so to speak. And so Saul reminds the officials that only he, not David, can provide them with important positions. These are the positions of being commander over thousands and hundreds. When you were a commander in the army in those days, you could make a living from your troops. Your troops would honor you by bringing you tribute and paying for some of the things that you needed for war. Remember, we saw David bring goods to the commander of his brothers. And so Saul says, look, David's not king yet. David doesn't have the patronage to give those positions out. Only I do. And so if you want to keep becoming rich and you want to keep benefiting from the positions you have in fighting against the Philistines, you better make sure that you stay loyal to me. And so Saul's trying to make sure that nobody bleeds off to David. Remember what we've seen happening already? People have been going out to David in the wilderness. They've been joining up to him. So far, it's only been sort of a ragtag group. Nobody all that important yet. Maybe one of the prophets, but they're a dime a dozen to Saul. That's not a big deal. He wants to make sure now that he does not lose any of his important officials to David. And so he reminds them of what he can give to them. Now, Doeg the Edomite, he's an outsider to the court. He's an outsider because he's from Edom. He's not an Israelite. But seeing what is going on between Saul and his most trusted advisors, Doeg being present, sees a chance to ingratiate himself to the king and to gain more honor. Remember, Doeg was Saul's chief shepherd, we had been told earlier. You wouldn't think a shepherd would be sitting in um, on a joint chiefs of staff meeting, right, or a meeting sort of of the board. But if Saul is preparing for war, it makes sense that Doeg the shepherd would be there. Why? Because what do you have to do? You have to feed an army. And so if you have to feed an army, you got to know how many sheep you have. Is there enough lamb, dried and ready to go to feed the troops? And so Doeg well could have been there from a provision standpoint. And so look at chapter 22, verses 9 through 10. It says, But Doeg the Edomite, who was standing with Saul's officials, said, I saw the son of Jesse, that's David, come to Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, at Nob. Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him. He also gave him provisions and the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Now we read about that incident already, so we know that Ahimelech acted in a very innocent way here, but Doeg spins the tale in a way that makes Ahimelech sound guilty. Because remember, David lied about the purpose of his visit to Nob. When he went to the priest, he said he was on a mission for the king. That's why he was out there, and he was out there alone because his men had to get moving and he would meet them at another spot. And remember, Doeg was there as well. Doeg knows that the priest did not know that David was rebelling against Saul. He never mentioned that that's what was happening. And so Doeg knows that the priests thought they were helping Saul as well as David. The priest thought that David was carrying out a mission on Saul's behalf. But Doeg doesn't tell the whole story. Doeg spins the story in a way that makes the priest look treacherous so that he, Doeg, can look loyal. Doeg lies or at least leaves out part of the truth so that he can make gain within the royal court. And so verses 11 through 13 tell us what happened as a result of Doeg's misrepresentations. It says, Then the king sent for the priest Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, and all the men of his family who were the priests at Nob. And they all came to the king. Saul said, Listen now, son of Ahitub. Yes, my lord, he answered. Saul said to him, Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, giving him bread and a sword and inquiring of God for him, so that he has rebelled against me and lies in wait for me, as he does today? Now, in these verses, Saul confronts Ahimelech and all of the priests of Nob. They've all come to Saul. They're meeting him at this tamarisk tree. He accuses them of aiding the enemy. Now, Saul wants to know why bread and why a sword were given to David in light of his enmity with Saul. Now, note that Saul also lies in what he says to the priests. So nobody here in Saul's group is speaking the truth because Saul claims that David lies in wait for him. Saul claims that David is waiting to ambush him and to kill him. That is not true, and Saul knows that's not true. Saul knows that David is running for him. It is Saul who lies in wait for David. So it's interesting. Saul accuses the priests who are innocent of evil while he is evil and trying to look innocent. It's a very twisted and corrupt world that we live in, isn't it? The same sort of thing goes on and happens today. Well, in verses 14 through 15, Ahimelech gives his reply to Saul. It says, Ahimelech answered the king, Who of all your servants is as loyal as David, the king's son-in-law, captain of your bodyguard, and highly respected in your household? Was that day the first time I inquired of God for him? Of course not. Let not the king accuse your servant or any of his father's family, for your servant knows nothing at all about this whole affair. And so Ahimelech's response is very simple, right? He says, one, I had no idea that David was a rebel against Saul. And then two, he said, I thought David was respected in your household. And he says, three, what I did when David came to me was the same thing I've always done for David, nothing more and nothing less. Right? Ahimelech rehearses here. One, David's always been loyal to you, Saul. I mean, he's your son-in-law. He's the captain of your bodyguard. So he's the guy you entrusted to keep others from killing you. And he's highly respected in your household. He was given a seat of honor at your table. How was I to know that he would rebel against you in light of his loyalty? And he says, two, he was respected in your household. Again, he repeats that idea. And then he says, what I did for him that day was what I would have always done for him. David has come to me before asking me to inquire of the Lord before he went out on missions for you. And so I didn't do anything new. None of these things prove that I was disloyal to you. And note throughout this whole thing, Ahimelech is continuing to state his loyalty to Saul, right? In verse 12, when Ahimelech answered Saul, he says, Yes, my Lord. He's addressing Saul as his king. And again, in verse 15, what does he say? He says, Let not the king accuse your servant. And again, he says, For your servant knows nothing at all about this affair. And so Ahimelech says, Who am I serving? I'm serving you. That's what I thought I was doing when I took care of David. But Saul does not accept Ahimelech's response. And so verse 16 says, But the king said, You will surely die, Ahimelech, you and your whole family. Now, does Saul not believe Ahimelech? Does Saul really think that Ahimelech was trying to help David and that he was disloyal to Saul? I suppose that Saul is paranoid enough here that we could believe that maybe he thinks that. But actually, I suspect that Saul knows very well that Ahimelech is innocent and that Ahimelech's story makes a lot of sense. But what Saul needs here is a scapegoat. What Saul needs here is someone that he can demonstrate upon what happens to traitors. And so Saul, he thinks, well, I don't really need the priest, but I need people who can fight. I need people who can lead army. I need people who can provide provisions for my armies. And so I'm going to sacrifice this priest here and I'm going to take care of him and kill him so that other people will know what happens when you're a traitor to me and so that other people will become loyal. And plus, Saul's not really devoted to Yahweh. We've seen before, he's not really devoted to God. And so the priests can be convenient ones to sacrifice so that everyone else is kept in line. And so verses 17 through 19 describe the murders of the priests of Nob. It says, Then the king ordered the guards at his side, Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because they too have sided with David. They knew he was fleeing, yet they did not tell me. But the king's officials were unwilling to raise a hand to strike the priests of the Lord. The king then ordered Doeg, You turn and strike down the priests. So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck them down. That day he killed 85 men who wore the linen ephod. He also put the sword Nob, the town of the priests, with its men and women, its children and infants, and its cattle, donkeys, and sheep. Now, some things to note here. One, note that Saul sort of changes the charges a little bit. He says that they have sided with David. Before he just said they didn't reveal David's plans to him. Saul has been all over the map with what he's accusing the priests of. That usually happens when you're accusing innocent people of things they did not do. The other thing to note here is the hesitancy of the royal guard to carry out Saul's orders and to kill the priests of Nob. If you think about it, the hesitancy of these priests is actually sort of interesting because the royal guard, they know their loyalty is being questioned. They know that Saul has just said, all you guys sided with Jonathan. I think I'm beginning to suspect that none of you are loyal to me, and I'm basically willing to have all of you killed or put to death. And yet, in spite of their loyalty being called to question, they still will not kill the priests. Why? Well, one, I think they won't kill the priest because they believe they're innocent. I think they have been privy to the conversation that Saul had with the priest. And I think that they believe the priest did not do anything wrong. I think they think that Ahimelech made a good defense of himself. But there's another reason that they won't kill the priest, the royal guard. And it's not just that they're innocent, it's also that they're priests, right? And they believe that Yahweh is going to avenge his holy men. We used to have that belief in our society. I don't really think it's still around anymore, but 30, 40 years ago, like people be like, oh, don't rob a church, or don't attack a priest, don't hurt a clergyman. That's no good. God's going to get you if you do that. Right? That was something that was viewed as a very serious offense. And so the royal guard is like, yes, Saul, we're afraid of you, but we are even more afraid of God. We are not going to go messing with his priests, especially when his priests are innocent, and we don't think they did what you're accusing them of. So, Saul, we are afraid of you, but we are much more afraid of falling into the hands of an angry God. We are not doing that. Now, I don't know that they verbally said no, but none of them moved forward to carry out the act. And Saul knows why, right? And so Saul is shrewd, right? Saul knows that an Edomite like Doeg won't fear Yahweh like an Israelite. Now, again, the Edomites have branched off from Israel. Esau had obviously known of Yahweh and at least given lip service to him at some point in his life. But the Edomites have probably largely left Yahweh behind and were worshiping other idols. And Saul also knows that Doeg is grasping for power. As an outsider to the court, as a foreigner, he wants to ingratiate himself and get into the center circle and get more reward for being a faithful servant. And so Saul knows that Doeg is not going to say no. He's going to see this as a tremendous opportunity to get exactly what he wants. And so Doeg is so enthusiastic for this opportunity that we're told he not only kills the priest, but he goes to the town and he kills all the elderly and the women and the children and the babies and the cattle and the donkey and the sheep. And this is really, really interesting because what Doeg does here is he treats the priests of Nob and their families like the Israelites were supposed to. They're supposed to treat the Canaanites. Remember when the Israelites came into the land, like when they went to Jericho, what were they told to do? They were told to wipe everybody out. And why were they told to wipe everybody out? Because their sin against God was so great. And so what Doeg here is doing is he's almost treating Saul like Yahweh. He's saying his sin against Yahweh is so great that there can be no innocent parties and all of the evil has to be removed and everybody has to be wiped out. A Doeg is not just he's not just executing the sentence for a crime. Doeg is conducting holy war against God's priest. And so, if you were an Old Testament reader, if you were reading this back in ancient times when it was first written, this would have been absolutely horrifying. Now, we read this and we're horrified because, 85 people are murdered plus the women and children. Like to us, that's bad enough. But they would have understood here that what Saul did was he took up a holy war against Yahweh's priests and you know that that is not going to end well in the long run. And so this is an absolutely horrific and shocking story, not just because of the blood loss, but because of the way that the murders are carried out. And so the shock value here in the ancient world would have been off the charts. And I think it's easy for us to miss that coming from a different culture and a different perspective. And so 1 Samuel 22, 20 through 23 tells us that one of the priests escaped Doeg's homicidal mission. It says, but one son of Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled to join David. he told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. Then David said to Abiathar, that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, I knew he would be sure to tell Saul, I am responsible for the death of your whole family. Stay with me. Don't be afraid. The man who wants to kill you is trying to kill me too. You will be safe with me. And so verse 20 tells us that one priest, Abiathar, manages to escape. And he reports to David what has happened to all of his relatives. He tells David about the horrible thing that has been done. Now, after hearing news of the priest's death, David confesses to a mistake he has made, right? David says he should not have let Doeg leave to tell Saul the news. So I guess either he should have taken Doeg captive, or he should have just killed him to prevent him from going back to Saul. I don't know what David thought the moral course would do, but David sees himself as responsible because he was foolish. In his haste to get away from Saul, he allowed something evil to happen that resulted in great suffering for Abiathar. And so, what you really are supposed to see here in David's remorse is how different David and Saul really are. Because Saul had no hesitation to kill dozens of innocent men. He had no hesitation to kill the priests of Nob. But David had hesitation to kill one man who was not innocent. That led to that man getting away and then to this terrible situation. So, what you see here contrasted in this story is that Saul and David have very, very different hearts. They have very different character. They are not the same type of person. And so as you run through these stories of Saul chasing after David, we're not just being told the story so we can say, yay, David got away, let's cheer for the hero. What you're also meant to see is how different Saul and David are. Because remember, this was being written when the Davidic kingship was still on the throne. This was being written when some in Benjamin might say, our relative got a raw deal. We're the ones who should be in charge. And the author Samuel has that apologetic purpose of saying, no, the line of David is the moral and the good and the righteous line. And it was Saul who was treacherous and evil and immoral. And so, again, as we go through this story, always note the character comparison between Saul and David. David is clearly going to be a man who fears the Lord, who does what the Lord wants him to do, while Saul is evil and conniving and deceitful. And so that character contrast stands big as we go through this part of the book of First Samuel. Now, David cannot undo his choice to let Doeg go, right? It's too late. Doeg told Saul all the priests except for Abiathar are dead. The only thing David can do now is give the priest Abiathar protection and care. And so Abiathar now is going to travel with David. And so one side now has a priest, David's side has a priest with them, and the other side has no priest because the other side murdered all the priests. And so this is a foreshadowing of who will win this struggle. And so I don't think we're going to get there tonight because it's getting a little late. But next week, as we go into chapter 23, you're going to see the advantage that David has in having the priest with him and in being on the Lord's side. There are strategic advantages that David is going to gain because of Abiathar's presence. Now, in the 21st century, they may not seem like huge advantages, but the people who believed in the spiritual world correctly and correctly believed in the power of Yahweh and the power of God, he will have a huge advantage by having the priest with him. And so this, whether we realize it or not, is a major turning point in the story. This is one of those times where, like, David's on the run, things look dire. It seems like Saul's about to come after him and catch him, but he now has a major advantage that Saul does not have. And so while things look bleak, you're getting a little note of hope here in the story by Abiathar now being with David. And so we'll just wrap up. We're not going to have time to go into chapter 23 tonight, but we'll wrap up with what do we learn from chapter 22? What lessons do we take from this? Well, one thing we can learn, unfortunately, this is not one of those, feel good, happy lessons, but one thing we can learn is that persecution may come against God's people, even when they're acting innocently and faithfully. And I think you see why I say that, right? Because the priests of Nob were doing nothing wrong. They were serving God with honor. They were being obedient to him. They thought they were serving Saul when they gave David the bread and when they gave David Goliath's sword. They thought that they were helping their nation Israel. They did not understand what they were doing was wrong in any way. Again, they had the little hint that David was alone that made them nervous. But as Ahimelech said, we had no reason not to trust David because he was so loyal to you, Saul. And so here you have these priests who are simply following God. They're doing the right thing, and it ends up in their persecution and ultimately their death. And so remember that being a Christian, even a faithful Christian, does not make you exempt from suffering. As a matter of fact, I would say the New Testament would take it a step further and say being a faithful Christian not only does not make you exempt from suffering, it also makes you more likely to suffer. Because when you serve the Lord and do his will, evil people will get upset with you. They will misinterpret what that you do, and they will stand against you. And so a lesson here that we learn from this chapter is that we need to be ready for persecution. And, I think persecution is becoming more and more likely in our world. Now, recently in the last month or two, we've seen some shifts starting to take place in our culture, which are moving away from some non-Christian understanding of the world and of society. But those forces are still there. They're very present. And certain stands that we take at work or wherever, we may be persecuted for. There are certain things we're not free to say or to do. And so one lesson we learn is we do have to be ready for persecution because even when we're serving well, it can come. But the second thing that we learn is that evil men cannot interrupt God's plans. Doeg tries to interrupt God's plans, right? He tries to tell Saul, hey, the priest rebelled against you, and but one priest escapes. One priest gets away, and that priest we're going to see next week becomes a big help to David and to his men. And so what we're going to see is everything is going against David here, but God is still at work. And, spoiler alert, God is going to protect him and watch over him. So even though Saul and Doeg are doing their very best, they are not going to be able to interrupt God's plan that David become king. Because remember, that's God's announced plan. David is going to be my next king. Evil men are trying to interrupt that plan. David is on the run in terrible circumstances, but evil men cannot interrupt God's plan. You say, but 85 men were killed here, these priests, it's dire. God's side is losing. No, evil men cannot interrupt God's plan. And so don't get nervous at the things that you see going on in the world, because the things that you see going on in the world can never, ever, ever interrupt God's plan. So yeah, there are things when you watch the news, you should be troubled in your hearts by the evil that you see. There are things going on that should give you pause, but they shouldn't take away your hope and they shouldn't make you fearful because God is still on his throne. Christ is still on the throne, and God's purposes will always win and will always, in the end, be met. And so nothing can separate us from the love of God. You think of Paul's famous words in Romans chapter 8. Evil will not interrupt God's plans, and we can be very confident of that. And we see that in this chapter at night. Again, this chapter is dark. Evil has occurred. It looks like evil is going to interrupt those plans, but I think most of you know the end of the story. It is not. The darkness is not going to win. And then the third thing to note is that, God often provides unlikely allies. David has people gathering around him and coming around him to help him who are not people you would expect to help. And of course, the most unlikely ally here is the king of Moab. Why would the king of Moab help Israel? They've been enemies forever. Well, again, you had that relative connection between David and Moab. And the king of Moab helps this close associate of Saul. Now, again, the king of Moab may have had some pragmatic reasons. He may have hoped that he was going to destabilize Saul's kingdom by sort of giving a little bit of aid and assistance to the rebel. He wasn't doing too much that Saul would get upset with him as Saul won, but there might have been a little pragmatic politics being played here. But whatever the reason for it was, this unlikely ally came to David's aid. And I have seen that even time and time again in my life, I've seen times where like there are people who I never thought would help me. People who weren't Christians, people who maybe mocked my Christian stance in the past, people who had given me difficulty or hardship at work, who were the very people who God rallied to give me assistance and to stand by me when I needed it the most. And so, even when you think you're all alone or there's no one to help you, God will provide you the most unlikely allies to bring you through difficult situations. And so, don't give up. And so, those are our lessons from First Samuel 22 tonight. Hopefully, that was encouraging